Right, well, good morning, and after that, what can we say? How can we be cheered, Richard, in this beautiful room? You set a massive challenge to the planetary health community, and we're here. This is a panel on economics, business, and finance, and one of those other noble people that you meet as you walk to conferences in Edinburgh is, of course, Adam Smith. I saw him standing in the Royal Mile this morning. He was buried in Canongate, not far from here, in 1790. The author of The Free Market Economics has a lot to answer for in a very positive way. Well-being is hugely improved around the world. Trade and enterprise has been a massive force for good. But as Richard has pointed out, we've got to a point where we need to think about things differently. And that's this panel's job, is to bring the here and now, and the future, I hope too, of economics, finance and business into this space and this conversation we've been having about planetary health over the last couple of days. Let me briefly introduce myself before we hear from the panel. My name's Sam Bickersteth, and I am the director of the Planetary Health Economic Council based at the Oxford University's Martin School. This is another initiative funded by the Rockefeller Foundation, in some sense a cousin of the Planetary Health Alliance. Over the next year, we're leading a global inquiry under a very well-connected council into the economics of planetary health, and are very keen to stay in touch with you and your community as we do that, to launch a report in the middle of 2019 next year. We're looking particularly at the policy dimensions, both for business and for policymakers of planetary health, and looking at clearly action solutions, moving from the impacts to the solutions. We're particularly interested in incentives, the role that markets, price signals, non-price signals, regulations, taxes, subsidies that are more in favor of planetary health can play. We're very interested in the issues of governance and institutional arrangements to deliver those for business, for states and for citizens, and the trade-offs that those institutions have to make. And we're interested in how we're going to measure that, how we're going to monitor and measure that, and value planetary health better. So at this uncertain period of capitalism, as Richard has just reminded us, this is a brilliant panel to help us address those questions. And we have Catherine Trebeck, who some of you met already as the Research Director of the Wellbeing Economy Alliance. Welcome this morning, Catherine. Jennifer Cole, who's my colleague from the Planetary Health Economic Council at Oxford. Andrew Cave, who's Head of Governance at Baillie Gifford, the large investment managers based close by here in Edinburgh. William Everson, who's in the Sustainability and Climate Change at PricewaterhouseCoopers, an old colleague of mine. And finally, Michael Weatherhead, who's a new part of the team at the Wellbeing Economy Alliance. So welcome to all of you. And Catherine, I suppose perhaps trying to build on Richard's tour de force just now, can you tell us a little bit about the purpose of economic growth? And I think clearly you're part of a movement, trying to lead a movement that's trying to help us think more deeply and purposefully about economic growth. And how can it be better steered in the direction of planetary health?
Thanks, Sam. Good morning, folks. So I guess it's really important to just really scrutinize the current state of play. We've heard over the last few days so many examples of how the current configuration of the economic system is doing so much harm to people and planet. And I think we've got governments often scrambling around to try and treat that and fix it and heal it and clean up better. But we need to look upstream. Just a quick show of hands, how many of you know a 4 or 5-year-old? Is it, yeah. And how often are they saying to you, why? Yeah, but why? But why? Now, I find that quite wonderful, because what they're maybe subconsciously doing is root cause analysis. And I think we need to be a little bit more like those 4-year-olds and ask, why is it that so much damage is being done to people and planet? Why are we spending so much energy? And that quote from Noam Chomsky from Richard earlier, you know, we're so very good at destroying the system. Why is it we're putting so much effort into treating and healing and fixing and just trying to keep on going with the current system? And so the more we ask why, the more we'll start to turn our attention to that economic configuration, to its short-termism, to the way so often profit is extracted and funneled up to the very few, to the way we externalise so much of the most important, most significant impacts, for good and for bad, and how it is still so patently orientated to a very narrow, often quite toxic form of growth in the form of gross domestic product. And I used to do fairly long talks and write about the problems of GDP, but it's really summed up in one quote by Mark Anelski, a Canadian economist, and he says, in GDP terms, the hero is a chain-smoking terminal cancer patient who crashes his car while going through to his job as an arms dealer because he's texting while eating a takeaway hamburger. And I mean, every single one of those activities is going to clock up points on the GDP ledger, but that's not the sort of person we need to help planetary health flourish. So I'm not saying all growth is bad. I'm not saying all growth is good. I'm saying that's a pretty stupid question, because growth is an abstract. We need to ask, growth of what? Growth for who? When? How? Where? And so often we've got these mounting evidence of diminishing marginal returns to the growth that we're currently focused upon. So not only are the benefits of growth attainable only under very certain conditions, when we put in particular policies to ensure that they're fairly distributed and created in a sustainable way, but we're also seeing this growing evidence of diminishing marginal returns, something I learned about in Economics 101, that growth is the benefits of growth in terms of social progress, in so many different ways of looking at social progress, are starting to tail off. But worse than that, people like Herman Daly are starting to point to that we're entering a stage in many situations of uneconomic growth, where the growth that is being created that's tallying up on that GDP ledger is because we're using the money to treat the harm. So to deal with a sort of GDP hero I just described, you know, to clean up his car accident and to, you know, treat after, you know, his job as an arms dealer. That's a sort of uneconomic growth. And in Scotland, we had a commission a couple of years ago called the Christie Commission, and it talked about this notion of failure demand, that so much of social policy, so much expenditure is expended dealing with the problems of economic inequality and the nature of the current economic system. And then in individual terms, equivalently, there's this concept from Serge Latouche of consolation goods. Almost how much of what we spend on ourselves is to console ourselves from these stressed, alienating, precarious lives. And Andrew yesterday talked about Dunkeld and the bakery there. And that baker will know to stop cooking the cake when it's done. She won't keep cooking it, but she'll use the benefits of cooking it till the right time. But she'll also know that you can't keep growing the pie, because the reality of planetary boundaries are that the oven is only so big. So it's time to turn our attention to, are we overcooking the cake, and how we distribute what's going on. And that is about creating an economic system that we call a well-being economy that delivers first time round. It's about the economy doing much more of the heavy lifting in terms of delivering social justice and sustainability inherently in how it operates, rather than just relying, as we currently are, on treating and healing and fixing and cleaning up. And the good news is that so much of this is already happening. And yesterday I talked a little bit about some amazing governments that are really pioneering to walk this path towards well-being economies. This morning we had a brilliant conversation around what business can do, and we'll hear about it a bit more today, around how to put in bacon, to carry on that metaphor, in the DNA of businesses, so that we can use commercial activity and profit-making as a vehicle to deliver social justice and sustainability, rather than an ends in itself. And across this conference, and you probably see this in your daily lives, there are so many examples of communities that are embodying this. I think our job as a planetary health community, and certainly as a Wellbeing Economy Alliance, and as activists and as concerned citizens, is to really try to change the regime around that so those amazing examples are no longer just the exception that proves the rule, but actually that is just how we do the economy, so it's a well-being economy.
Thank you, Catherine. Yes, about 40 of us. 40 of us gathered for a working breakfast this morning, and there was a sense of optimism about solutions, and I thank you for bringing that into the room. But if planetary health is to be a total response to the crisis that we're in, to paraphrase some of what Richard Horton said earlier, it's a daunting task of many interdependencies. And Jenny, we're working on drawing some of those interdependencies out to see how they can be better valued and understood in the world of economics and business. Can you tell us a little bit about that? I believe you have a slide, so we may have a magical appearance of a slide. Let's see. Why don't you start?
Yeah, I did have some slides, but I'm not quite sure how you get them up. I'm happy to without them.
There they are.
Yeah, so one of the things I'm very interested in, particularly looking downstairs at the poster sessions, is we're very much in the problem space. Everybody knows there's a big problem. Everybody knows what the problems are. We're measuring the problems. We've got evidence for the problems. We're looking at the problems. But if we want to get past those problems, we've actually got to look for the solutions, and we've got to look at what the business case, so what the economic and business case is for those solutions. So that's what we've been doing in some of the papers that we're working on in the Oxford Martin School, is looking at where are those interconnections and where are the business cases you can make. So I'm just going to go through a couple of the examples of the ones that I've been working on and kind of what I've learnt from those about how we change the system as a whole and how we actually make a case and incentivize the people who can take us to the solution space. So if I start with sanitation, the business case of sanitation, what do we know? What's the problem space? Diarrhea is a factor in 1.4 million annual deaths. It's one of the biggest killers in the world. It's responsible for 100 million dailies, disability-adjusted life years. Poor sanitation is a factor in 80% of environmental-related deaths, and it costs countries up to 7% of their GDP. So we can see that straight away there's an economic case for changing sanitation. And if we look in terms of the health as a system, we just think of it maybe as having toilets. If we look again at the water and sanitation in the SDGs and the development goals, it started off just being, have you got a decent toilet? It's since moved to how do we look at waste management as a whole, as a system? And the advantage of that is once you start to look at sanitation as a system, it's not only about how we stop people getting, being crude, exposed to poo, and therefore getting bacteria through poo and getting diarrhea. We start to look at how we can recover slurry for fertiliser. So how can we actually make an industry out of that? How can we sell fertiliser back to farmers? We can recover micronutrients from the wastewater, which again, we can use as fertiliser. We can put that back into the system, so we're improving nutrition. We can create biogas and green energy. So the methane isn't just going out into the atmosphere, it's actually being turned into electricity. And that can be done even at a household level. In lower and middle income countries, from the toilet itself, you can create enough energy to power your mobile phone. So if you're not connected to the electricity grid, you've suddenly got communication abilities out of that. You're creating a waste management industry. You're creating jobs for people who come and clean out your toilet, for the company that hires you your toilet or sells you your toilet, who connects to the waste management plant. There's an incentive for local municipal governments to invest in a waste management plant because they're seeing all of these benefits for the community, for the company, for health, for waste management. You're improving the environment when you're doing it. So suddenly what you've done by looking at sanitation not only as a way to improve health, you've turned it into a system that has economic and business benefits. And while you're doing that, you've improved what you actually intended to. Sanitation could reduce rates of diarrhea by 32 to 37%. Economic gains in India could be as high as $54 billion annually. And there's an estimated investment in sanitation of $5 to $16 for every dollar spent. So you're not just talking about the problem space anymore, you're talking about the solutions. And then one of the things that is really interesting for me and for my own research interest in this is my research area is antimicrobial resistance. I'm a biological anthropologist by background. I'm not an economist. I'm not an accountant. So if I start to look at that in terms of sanitation and its relationship to AMR, one of the biggest issues with antimicrobial resistance is not actually the use of antibiotics in human health, it's actually the use of antibiotics in livestock. Now, initially, that was driven by the same reason that humans get infections: overcrowded, poor quality conditions for animal welfare, with bad sanitation. And because of that, antibiotics started to be used to prevent infections rather than to treat them. And the farmers found from that a side benefit that actually it worked as a growth promoter. If you give animals antibiotics, they grow more quickly because it changes the gut antimicrobiome so that they absorb nutrients more quickly. That means that you use more antibiotics, it causes more problems with antibiotic resistance that gets into the human health system. The resistant genes also affect humans, you have more problems in human health. So if you sort out sanitation in animal welfare, you also actually go quite a long way of solving the issues of antimicrobial resistance in humans. And one of the things there that you get is all of these benefits that you get from sanitation. So you take down greenhouse gas emissions, you get biogas, you take down eutrophication, you get better fertilizer use, you don't put heavy metals into the system, you get less pollution. They also work from another dimension. So suddenly, as an antimicrobial resistance researcher, sanitation becomes much more important to me as well. I'm pushing the buttons of another sector. And then if I take that further, I'm changing the system. The biggest overuse is in livestock due to poor hygiene and overcrowding. It's used as a growth promoter. Who else can I leverage who will also care about those things in the way that I do in terms of human health? And you start to look at their animal welfare questions, there are dietary questions, there's the overuse of meat. We start to push buttons of a lot of other sectors. And the bad news, there'll be 10 million annual deaths by 2050, biggest impact will be lower in middle-income countries. There's little incentive to farmer to reduce in new antibiotics, there's not much profit in it from them. We can start to see where else the profit might lie for other sectors. Who else can benefit from this, and how can we incentivize them by pulling them along? And we're doing that by looking at where those connections are. Who is interested? Who might work with us on this? Where are our partnerships? And if we look again, then we start to make very simple systems dialogues. We start to look at the livestock industry as actually a partner in improving human health through reducing antibiotic resistance. We reduce antibiotic resistance in general, but we also create healthier diets. We perhaps push people towards less meat-based diets and also meat that has less growth promoters in it that are passed on through the food chain. We look at animal welfare, and that has better conditions for the animals. It also gets more animal welfare into people's mindsets. It may lead to less meat consumption in general. Now, we're seeing here a conference where suddenly all of the catering is vegetarian. I'm not sure that would have been the case 5 to 10 years ago. We're already seeing societal changes to the things that make our health better in general. And we're also affecting greenhouse gas emissions as well, by looking through the waste management, by capturing that methane, by changing the use of antibiotics so that it doesn't affect the gut microbiome and affect methane production in the first place. But we also create biogas. We also create clean energy. So we've suddenly gone from two sectors that you wouldn't necessarily have said that sanitation and the healthcare sector for antimicrobial resistance and livestock and greenhouse gas emissions and animal welfare and the move to more vegetarian diets all fit together. But actually once we do, what we see is incentives. And I think what we need to do as an academic community is to be looking more at that solution space, putting those costs on things. I was going through the poster session yesterday, picking out the posters that I think go some of the way down that system, but not from end to end. And actually saying to researchers, okay, here's the problem space. You've told me the environmental damage. You've told me the health impact. I know there are figures on that from the global burden of disease. Go and put those figures on it, and then work out what you would need to solve that problem. How many waste management workers do you need? How many sanitation trucks? Do you need a waste management plant? Who can invest in it? And then we've got a business case to go to policymakers and say, not only do this because it's the right thing to do, because that doesn't always wash with policymakers, go and do this because this is actually how you will spend the taxes of your voters in a way that they will see a benefit. And I think that's actually a much more powerful message to take away.
Jenny, thank you very much. I'd like to go on to Thanks for taking it to something tangible that we can engage with. We can come back to any other slides. Will, you are working in the sustainability and climate change at PwC. You work with private clients. Why is business, or why should business be interested in planetary health? And when are they starting to shift, and how are they starting to shift into this agenda that you know, so in a way Jenny set out the theory of the costs and benefits. They're there on paper, but when is business really integrating this into their modalities?
Good question. And more than many people might realize is probably the short answer. I'm going to say I used to call myself an economist, and then I found that I had to start calling myself an economist and then apologizing. And then I started calling myself an environmental and health economist, and I got quite comfortable with that. And then I came across this terminology of planetary health, and I thought, wow, planetary health economist sounds pretty cool. And now, you know, obviously I want to be a 21st century economist, and that's what I aspire to. So I don't know whether, you know, Kate and Catherine would agree, but you know, certainly my objective. So, and I'm often struck in these instances where that it feels like business, academia, public policy folk, we actually inhabit just completely separate worlds. And I've been fortunate enough to kind of bridge those worlds to some degree. Lots of the things I've been involved in have been about bridging, and really about taking the good stuff that's done in academia and crudely applying it with private sector organizations who've never seen anything like it. So that is really how I've built what passes for my career. And I suppose, so the main thing I suppose I bring is hopefully is good tidings from the world of business. I think the first thing to say is probably that kind of Econ 101 caricature of a narrow profit maximizing business. If it isn't already dead in practice, then it's certainly dying out, and extremely rapidly. We've got, you know, when you have CEOs of organizations like Apple and Unilever saying, you know, if actually saying to their shareholders, if what you're looking for is short-term profit maximization, put your money elsewhere, you know there's a change going on. One of the most striking things in my world that happened recently was a letter from Larry Fink. I don't know if stick your hand up if anyone has the remotest idea what I'm talking about. One person, 2 people, 3 people, 5 people. So it's worth me saying this because Larry Fink is probably the, you know, he is the archetypal, incredibly successful capitalist. He is the founder, CEO, chairman of an organization called BlackRock, which is the world's biggest asset manager. He owns more stakes in more companies than probably anyone else in the world. And he used his annual letter to CEOs. This is where he sends a letter to every single CEO of all the companies they invest in. This year he used it to really hammer home the point that as a business, you need to have a purpose, and you need to know what that purpose is and be able to articulate it, and that purpose needs to be broader than maximizing profit. I'm going to quote from his letter because it's really striking. He said, "Society increasingly is turning to the private sector and asking that companies respond to broader societal challenges. The public expectations of your company have never been greater. To prosper over time, every company must not only deliver financial performance, but must show how it makes a positive contribution to society." So this is really the archetypal capitalist saying, this is non-optional anymore. So it's clear, profit is not a purpose. It is and has been an incredibly useful, motivating tool, and it's been helpful for clarifying incentives. And it's not something we want to chuck away, but clearly we need a broader set of measures of success for different types of private sector organization. And really, I wanted to mention briefly, because I want I do want to be able to respond to other people's questions as well, but the three big things that I'm seeing that are going on at the moment. So one is this, there's been this explosion of activity under a banner of natural capital. And this is in the private sector I'm talking about, but it does bridge the divide between those worlds. And that's a banner that I like because for the first time it's engaging really senior people in business in better management of the environment and environmental systems. And it's going way beyond conventional environmental management to think about the environment as a system and really to think about how companies, yes, how they impact on the natural environment, but also how they fundamentally depend on it, how they can't operate without it. And so that is what the natural capital movement is doing. And I think one organization in particular stands out, the Natural Capital Coalition, which is a big multidisciplinary organization bringing together folks from business, from academia, from public policy, trying to bridge those divides and get better outcomes. Now, really, somewhat linked to that, the second thing I'm seeing a lot of and doing a lot of is valuing environmental impacts and dependencies. And what we're doing, and certainly what the leading companies are doing, is not just a sort of narrow extension of a neoclassical economic model. Actually, we're looking, for example, at how does the value of impacts increase exponentially as you approach planetary boundaries. And so as long as as long as we're treating and using economics in the right kind of ways in that context, I'm seeing it as an incredibly powerful tool. And the last thing, and this is really exciting at the moment for me, so a lot of environmental valuation actually comes down to valuing impacts on people's health. Anyone who's sort of familiar with the broad space knows that environmental economics is founded in welfare economics. It's a short step from welfare economics to health economics. And, again, borrowing from the best stuff that's been being done in academic and policy circles, I borrow a lot from the Institute of Health Medicine and Evaluation, IHME, and their work on the global burden of disease and disability-adjusted life years. And actually, in the private sector, this concept of, particularly in health services, but including in private healthcare providers in the US, this concept of setting objectives, organizational objectives around how many healthy life years do we create as an organization is a radical new idea. I mean, it would even be a radical idea in the NHS, frankly, but it's an extremely radical idea in the US. And it's gaining some really interesting traction. And one of the most striking things to come out of some of that work, my last point, is that one of the things it shows up almost immediately is that activities in community health, in population health, in what we normally talk about as public health in the UK, are ordinarily tremendously more effective at generating healthy life years, adding healthy life years for people, than are enormously expensive clinical interventions. So different measures of success, valuation as a tool, and bringing together these schools under a banner of natural capital. I think those are the big driving forces.
Thanks very much, Will, indeed. So, Richard, you instructed us to work on reviving the dream of intergenerational progress. And I think Catherine and Jenny and Will are all sort of raising our spirits a little bit this morning to deal with your challenge. But Andrew Cave, I want to push you a little bit more because you're not Larry Finks and you haven't got trillions, but you've got nearly 200 billion in your company. Your company states publicly that it's investing for the long term, but we know that stock markets don't do that. We know that the short-term thing is what's happening. That dominates the scene. We need investors. We need to pay for this stuff that Jenny's been presenting to us, whether it's the challenges of AMR or access to sanitation. And we know there are benefits, but the markets aren't responding. Why not?
Thank you. That's a great question and a great way into a whole range of different issues. First off, just one small correction. You said that we have 200 billion of money invested. You do. We invest money on behalf of public pension plans. That's our core client. We put the savings of, in political speak, ordinary hardworking people to work in the economy. It's not our money. It's actually we're investing on behalf of clients. And when we do that, we're trying to create a sustainable long-term return. Now, if that's fundamentally inconsistent with how those clients want to live in the world and the changes they would like to see, then we have an issue. We have this sort of fundamental disconnect between what we're doing for our clients on a short-term basis and what they actually would like us to achieve. So, I think it's a really interesting question. Baillie Gifford is the biggest kind of company no one's ever heard of in Edinburgh. It's a 110-year-old investment manager based just down the road, about 1,100 staff. We are one of the longest-term investors in the market. That's 5 to 10 years kind of investment horizon for most funds. And we do say that our ideal hold period is forever. So now that might not be, by market standards, we may be more long-term, but you're absolutely right. We have a fundamental problem, not just in the economy, but in the investment industry with short-termism. But it's also a problem in business. We have a sort of very negative cycle right now of businesses engaging in financial engineering, share buybacks, spurious M&A activity to try and generate short-term value. When actually we know a lot of that doesn't generate long-term value. So as investors, we try and encourage management teams to think long-term, to invest in the business, to invest in R&D, to think about socially useful products, which will ultimately, have a sort of future growth market. Now, we're not saints. We invest in, right across the economy. We're led by our clients in terms of what they would like us to invest in. So, I'm not saying we have no responsibility, but we work very closely with our clients in terms of what they would like to restrict or not restrict in their funds, whether they want to have the maximum investable opportunity from all companies. And the trustees of those big pension plans have this difficult challenge because they're trying to, balance out well-funded schemes which will allow their members to retire with meeting other kind of sustainability goals. So it's not an easy challenge, and there's kind of legalistic red tape along the way with respect to fiduciary responsibility and how much license the trustees have to attach social and environmental conditions to investment funds. That's different in different markets, and in the US, for example, there's a lot of caution around about that because the legal guidance isn't clear. In Europe, you're getting a lot more momentum around flipping the onus to be, making it the responsibility of trustees to integrate environmental and social considerations, and they would therefore be remiss if they didn't, which is an interesting flip of the onus of responsibility. So, I think there's some big structural issues. I would say for us, first off, I feel I should play the role of defending for-profit business just momentarily. First off, if there's no for-profit business, we will have nothing to invest your pensions in. So we'll have a challenge, and I love social enterprise, but I think this is one of a number of different organizational structures for delivering goods and services that people want. It's not always perfect. Some social enterprises aren't terribly social, actually, in terms of the way they operate. Some for-profit businesses are actually incredibly thoughtful, long-term businesses that really focus on customers. So, I think we need to be careful of latching on to new concepts as the solution. That they're not. They're just different organizational approaches, which I think helpfully flag up the big question is what's the actual purpose of the business? What's the objective? So, I think we should be very open to lots of different models. We should encourage the fact that this is sort of giving away my kind of centrist politics here, but I believe you use different structures for delivering different services. So some services are rightly delivered by the state, as wholly owned state services. Others are delivered by charities, others by social enterprise, and others still by for-profit business. And that's a wholly legitimate way to structure activity in the economy. So that said, we do recognize that there's the short-termism in markets does lead to some very difficult, short-term business decisions which need to be challenged. For me personally, I'm actually much more optimistic than some of the speakers. I do think I might live in a bubble. I think I probably do. Well, you saw Dunkeld yesterday. It is a bit of a bubble. But that said, I think we're at an inflection point. I think we're seeing some very interesting changes. This conference couldn't have happened 5 years ago. The discussion we just had at the business breakfast could not have happened 5 years ago. It's fair to say. And we're seeing a different generation of leadership coming into business, because it's all about leadership, by the way. So we have a fantastic new fund called the Positive Change Fund, which is our first impact investment fund. The idea came from one of our millennial investment analysts who wrote a paper, and the partnership agreed to seed fund it. Now, delighted to say Positive Change wasn't just inspired by millennial, but it's under female leadership. Kate is at the back. I'm going to embarrass her now, but Kate, give a wave. Kate is a rare thing, a sort of senior female fund manager leading a portfolio. So hugely excited about the work Kate and her team are doing and for the potential for that product. And I think it would be completely fair to say we're seeing an absolute avalanche of interest in the Positive Change Fund from big pension plans right around the world. We've still got work to do, and we have to kind of grow it at a sustainable rate, but huge excitement around that. And in our business, there's all the chatter is around some of these new products. We're integrating environmental, social, and governance considerations across all of our funds. So, there is now no fund, sort of no mainstream fund, which hasn't had some kind of conversation about ESG risks and characteristics. So I think it's a fantastically energetic time to be in business. And, maybe we're 20 years too late. I don't know, but I don't think so. I think there's still time if we can re-engineer some of the existing vehicles in a way that works for everybody. I think we've got hope. Just to finish on the bakery, I'm not sort of navel-gazing, focusing on the micro and Dunkeld, but just two things. The bakery is a for-profit business, but it's also, I think, one of the world's first zero-waste bakeries because it sells out every single day. So, the opening times are from 9 a.m. until sold out. How else could you do that? So that's a sort of an entrepreneur-led small micro business for profit, but doing something incredibly useful. And just a final point as well. Leadership. It's across business, but it's also in communities. My cameo role yesterday about Dunkeld was really to say, I asked some questions but didn't answer them. If I was trying to answer them, I would say, it's all about leadership and business leadership or community leadership. It's not about state interventions and policy interventions from afar. It's about people taking ownership of issues, either in business or communities. And I'm going to embarrass someone else by name-checking Graham Cook from Safari, who's in one of the back rows over there. Graham's wife Jess was the inspiration behind a lot of the work that led to the boards here from the kids, taking ownership of local issues, founding a climate cafe in the village for people to come and talk about issues and environmental space. So, we need to stop thinking about that leadership as, something that just happens in sectors. It's right across these different spheres of activity. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrew. Yes, you reminded me the sort of social purpose of business in where we're standing, of course, because this is a very large beer hall built by McEwan's, isn't it? So, we owe a lot to that and that sense of learning that emerged from the profit that was generated from a successful Victorian entrepreneur. Michael, you've been working with the New Economics Foundation, working for, I think, probably for governments, for businesses, and for the third sector. And I suppose I'd like to challenge you on what you're seeing from your experience a bit in terms of new forms of valuation. Will talked about the natural capital valuation and coalition work, and we've heard a bit about new business purpose, Lau Fink's trying to set out new directions for investors. But aren't we just tweaking the system? Is this transformative change that we're seeing? Are we at this point of inflection as Andrew's just change, or are these new forms of valuation just still a sort of marginal thing that's happening to the kind of people that turn up for panels like this?
Thanks, Sam. Okay, so do I think it's tweaking at the edges or do I think it's transformational? I think it's a stepping stone. So yes, while over the past decade at the New Economics Foundation I was doing a lot of work around social and economic valuation for all kinds of organizations, be they third sector, be they private organizations. And I think my mind shift has sort of moved a little bit, if you like. In some of the trainings we used to give, we sort of quoted I don't know who waded through The Wealth of Nations, the Adam Smith book, to actually find this quote saying that price is not a precise thing, it's due to the higgling and bargaining of the market. Fantastic 17th century sort of word there. But it's good enough to get on with the business of life, of actually sort of exchange, if you like. And our sort of mantra was, well, you know what, it's not a perfect science, social and environmental valuation, but if it allows us to improve our decision making, then although not precise, then, you know, it's something which is a positive thing. And I think, you know, I generally agreed with that, but then slightly shifted my opinion over the years, particularly in the last few when I was living in South Africa, because I was supporting and helping one of the larger accountancy firms out there with alternative valuation techniques. And it came to one piece of work they were doing for an enormous new coal-fired power station. So at that particular moment, we were having this fantastically titled thing called load shedding, which is just a fancy term for blackouts in South Africa, because the Eskom, the electricity company, were just not getting the electricity situation right, and we were looking in the newspaper and finding out when the lights were about to go off. So there was this big push for this coal-fired power station, and this accountancy firm were asked to do a sort of a triple bottom line, if you like, social, economic, and environmental valuation of it. And so I was helping them with the social side of it. But when the final result came out, it came out that it was a positive, so that the economic benefits of reducing the load shedding and keeping the lights on, which inevitably is a good thing, massively outweighed the fact that this was proper 20th century old school fossil fuel technology. And so that slightly concerned me with, well, how did you do the environmental valuation where a socking great coal-fired power station can come out looking good? Particularly, you know, when we're in a race to actually move towards clean energy, and frankly, we need to move towards zero carbon. So that slightly shook my belief, I think, in valuation. So I think it is absolutely a necessary stepping stone, but to be honest, if companies move to the point where they, in fact, have a regenerative agenda on the table, so they create the incentives and the processes and the policies whereby actually bringing water in, for example, into your plant and putting it out in a better state than it came in, if you're actually baking that into the DNA of your business model, then I don't know whether or not you'll actually need to be worrying about that valuation in the future. But for now, for sure, it's definitely getting it into the conversations. It's getting it onto the balance sheet, as you might say, and getting those who perhaps wouldn't have thought about it, or who only deal with numbers, perhaps CFOs amongst organizations, to actually consider it. So it has served a purpose, but I sort of feel it's certainly not where we're needing to be if we're moving to, for example, a well-being economy, as articulated by Catherine.
Thank you, Michael, very much. So before we turn to any questions from the audience, I'd like to put a challenge back to you, because I feel the empty chair here probably should be a public policy maker or a public policy economist, the kind of person that advises the Minister of Finance. And this morning over breakfast, there was a conversation a bit about the regulatory side. We talked more about the markets, I feel, in this conversation. And your reference to coal is really like the premier example, really, where mandates can and are already having an impact. I'd like to ask members of the panel if there was sort of one message for, one space in the regulatory world that could accelerate action towards a good planetary health agenda. What would it be? What would your message to put a regulation in place be? Anybody want to make a suggestion? Catherine, why don't you have a crack at that?
Because I think one of the areas of public sector activity that's got extraordinary potential, and we're already seeing hints of it, but sadly not enough leverage, is the area of procurement and the way the government chooses to bend its spend. I would love to see a world where we all celebrate procurement officers throughout government agencies as extraordinarily radical agents of a wellbeing economy because of how they direct what they buy, how they buy, and the incentive systems that they put in place. So I think procurement's a great underutilised lever, but there's a lot of also examples of hints around the potential of procurement to deliver these sort of objectives that we're already seeing.
And are we seeing that is there a movement within the NHS for a more sustainable public procurement processes? I mean, where do we see that opening up that conversation, at least in the UK?
Will, who's probably more experienced with the health sector in the US, a lot of those big, massive health companies in the US are using their leverage, and universities, and I suspect, the fact that it's all the food here is all meat-free is a tiny little example of that. I mean, it's those decisions that at one level are really simple and often fly away without much thought, but another level, they're extraordinarily powerful decisions, and across those sort of layers of impact, I think there's a lot of potential if we just think twice about what we buy and using that big footprint still that the public sector has in terms of what it purchases.
So vegetarian food only in the Treasury in Whitehall, we move towards that. Okay, any other suggestions for public policy makers? Andrew, do I see you?
Yeah, so first of all, there's some great stuff going on. So just yesterday, the Scottish government...
Microphone, please, Mike. Can you speak to the microphone?
So there's some great stuff going on. Just yesterday, the Scottish Government pledged to phase out single-use plastic in their facilities over the coming years. So there's already some great stuff going on. I personally, I don't want to see lots more regulation. It's not that I'm against. I think regulation where it's required is really, really helpful. But actually, we need to engage people in behavioural change is probably the biggest thing we need to do. And that's not necessarily best achieved by hard regulation. So I'm not sure I have an immediate sort of policy solution, but I just think if we can think more about carrots and sticks, I think what are the kind of incentives to encourage businesses to change, for example. I think that's a much more sort of interesting space, and you get a lot more energy throwing at problems.
I mean, it's quite incredible, really, in the current system where taxes and subsidies are such powerful vehicles that we're still subsidising fossil fuels and we're whipping out the carpet from underneath solar feed-in tariffs. It's really not recognised so much that there is such a phenomenal subsidisation of the fossil fuel industry, and it's still taking place. And I understand why it is. There's huge pressures and there's invested interests, etc. But if you're going to use these levers, which are often touted as the only levers we can use at government, well, use them in the right way. So that might not be a bad place to focus.
No, that's great.
I've got a quick panacea as well, which is, it baffles me that we're still, GDP is still our measure, and I know countless commissions have looked at the question of going beyond GDP in various ways. I'm amused by something from the natural capital space, which is the UK government has made this bold commitment to include natural capital in the UK government accounts by 2020, which is great news, I think. Like, it is recognition of natural capital. The thing that amuses me about it is, who's ever seen a UK balance sheet? Who has any idea what the UK capital balance is? Nobody. I mean, I've yet to meet a government economist who can tell me that. And so even just that very basic shift towards recognizing stocks rather than just measuring our annual flow. Obviously, there's work through the World Bank and OECD and others who do this, but it just has no prominence. Giving that prominence would be a very simple and major step forward.
Right. Jenny, do you want to add?
And I would say one thing that I would say as well, having come from 10 years working in a policy think tank, is it's still incredibly and ridiculously difficult for bits of government to move money around from one government department to another. And I think actually a really radical thing in 10 years' time would be, could we have NHS and DEFRA working together to run healthy food stalls on the high street? And actually then ploughing that money back both into the agricultural sector to encourage more healthy food production and food systems, and into the NHS to improve better health. And we can't do that. There seems to be a problem doing that, in the same way that that's not the case in the private sector. In the private sector, if Bupa decided that they wanted to run gyms or run cafes, there's nothing to stop them doing it. And I think we actually need to change that siloing of government so that that kind of redistribution of money into places where it can have benefits across different sectors is needed as well.
Great, thank you for those ideas. Questions or ideas from the floor? There are mics left and right if people want to head to those. I need to be in a place where I can see the speakers, so there's these screens in the way. So why don't we start with 3 questions from the left, and then we're going to have a lot on the right. Would you like to start?
The University of Sydney. Thank you very much for the panel. Really important issues raised. When we're talking about solutions, I think we really need to have the people involved who are part of those solutions. So if we're going to be talking about food, I think we need to have farmers. So great to have PwC here. And I would think we also, if we're going to talk about healthy food, farmers normally do produce the best food they can under the economic circumstances. So possibly we also need farmers. So my question to you is, as we move forward, can we consider having meetings in places where people are nutritionally challenged, where they don't have easy access to good quality food? And can we please involve the people who actually have to live every day and make a living that are involved with these solutions? Thank you.
That's a good question for the organisers as much as the panel, but great suggestion. Thank you very much.
Hi, I'm Laura Kwong from Stanford University. And I agree that many large companies have made big improvements in becoming socially and environmentally more grounded, but a lot of the worst polluters are the small companies or not companies at all. People that are doing artisanal mining or running a brick kiln or releasing pesticides into the environment as a small farmer. And so I'm wondering what your recommendations are from you or from people in low-income countries and middle-income countries that are facing these challenges. What are your recommendations for those companies who they really do need to make the most money they can from their perspective because they're living in poverty, and so money is what they need to put food on the table?
Yeah, thank you. Great questions about scale, informal sector, and people in low incomes. Really important points. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Martin Henshaw. I'm a health economist from the University of Tasmania and in the Tasmanian state government. Two-parter, a quick warm-up really for Catherine and Michael. How do you think we might get particularly ecological economists involved in planetary health, because they're conspicuously absent from this meeting? But then for the panel, and really for everybody, so Richard's call to action about really a response to, what did he say, an inquiry into the total world. Look, that's explicitly a call for an ideological solution. I would tend to agree with him on that. We have an example, the best example of how ideological change was achieved without a revolution was by the Mont Pelerin Society, who brought us neoliberalism. And they spent several decades very single-mindedly and determinedly pursuing that ideological objective. Particularly in a room full of scientists, I think I'd pose the question, do we actually have the stomach to take on that ideological challenge?
Whoa, so great set of questions. Who wants to pick up on any of those? Catherine, are you prepared to tackle ideology or scale?
Yeah,
go first.
Australian accent after Australian accent. Yeah, brilliant questions. Thank you. Robin, I don't know where she's gone. Entirely agree. And we've certainly, the way we'll be designing the activities of the Wellbeing Economy Alliance is massively about inclusion and participation, because we have no chance of embodying, let alone achieving this sort of shift that we need, if it's not working with and for the people who are currently shafted by the current way of doing things. So and I've had the delight to be involved in some of the projects of really putting the voices of the most marginalised at some of these repurposing of the economy before, and it's powerful, beautiful stuff. And happy to chat later about some of that. I didn't catch your name last from Stanford, but thank you. And I think I entirely agree that there are very much places where we need to focus just creating more, whether it's growth, whether it's more income. And when I talk about diminishing marginal returns, it's like the graphs are so extraordinarily obvious. At the beginning stages of economic development, you see pretty significant returns, whether it's in terms of life expectancy or various other dimensions of social progress. The big caveat to that is there needs to be very positive, deliberate policy regimes to make sure that it's not growth at the same time as poverty being increased as well. As we've seen, for example, in Nigeria, huge growth at the same time as poverty rising. So it's not just carte blanche growth without thinking about who it's directed to and how it's being created. But there are very real returns at those early stages. And the figures are different, but it's really around about the sort of 20 US per capita where those diminishing marginal returns start to kick in. And so that benefit starts to increase less steeply. And so it's in those stages where we need to think about doing things differently and quite literally making ecological room so that the artisanal farmer and the artisanal miner and the smallhold farmer can have a chance to increase their basic living standards. So I entirely agree with you, but there's sort of a duality of the conversation there that's vital. Martin, thank you. We work quite a bit with ecological economists, including some of the founding fathers of ecological economics, and who do a lot of work around the natural capital space. They're a huge part of this growing movement, the Wellbeing Economy Alliance. So next time, let's do this conference together. Really, really happy to bring our friends from that sector.
Kate.
And noticing, if not replicating identically, how that shift from Keynesianism to what some people would call neoliberalism happened, does yield quite useful lessons for what we need to do to set about creating that next shift for an economy that is purposed front and centre to deliver first and foremost for people and planet. And so it's about how we communicate these messages to voters, to people who drive taxis, to people who, bake the bread, to just outside sort of beautiful conference rooms to everyone. So there's a message of communication and accessibility and inspiration that's really vital. But it's also about galvanizing all the work that's happening and creating a movement so that this amazing work is no longer the exception. And that's something, again, that we're really hoping to inculcate.
Thanks,
Michael,
Catherine. Andrew.
Yeah, just following on the point, the fantastic question from the lady from Stanford. I think so. That is a really great question, and I think one thing we have to do is get rigorous as we go forward from here, and that we need good measurement of impacts, and we need to properly appraise different organizations fairly. And actually, some of the biggest businesses are doing the most to progress our thinking on fixing issues because they have the scale and capacity to do so. They're able to set up central research and development teams, hiring in scientists to look at these big issues. So we have to be careful of kind of misty-eyed romance of the kind of small-scale producer. A long time ago, when I was doing research at SOAS University down in London, I looked at effectively the productivity of smallholders in India, and what you find is the idea of kind of very smallholder plots is an appealing notion, but it's actually very unproductive. If you actually look at the broader question of how do you get affordable food to populations in rural areas, it doesn't do a good job of addressing that need. So yeah, I think that's really true. Just since we're in the whole of beer, William McEwen, the brewer, put the money up for this fantastic hole we're in today. That's a very good example where the big brewing industry has been absolutely on the back foot from craft breweries. Now, I love craft beer, it's a fantastic idea, but I'm very sure the the ecological impact of lots of very small-scale, inefficient breweries probably isn't great. And I think that's where we need to sort of look more honestly and thoughtfully at different business models and sort of give them a fair appraisal.
Thank you. And to go back to the floor, because there's this sort of massive people over there that want to share their perspectives. Short comments, please. I'd love to hear from you.
Thank you. I'm Nicole DePaolo, Executive Director of Global Health Asia Institute. My question is, we're talking about the economies of the future, and are we exploring the technologies of the future? I wonder if someone mentioned the redistribution of money. So is anyone studying how blockchain, for example, can help us to achieve planetary health goals? Thank you.
Thank you, yeah.
Hi, I'm Natalia Linu from UNDP. One comment and one question. The comment is we've found that the insurance industry is actually quite aligned, and UNDP has started partnering with them. Are there other companies that actually have a lot to lose from inaction on planetary health? And then on the cost-benefit analysis, we do a lot of this return of investment, but what worries me personally is that we go to a Ministry of Finance and say, if you invest in girls' education, you get this return. If you invest in water and sanitation, this investment, NCD prevention, and to some extent, does that overwhelm the policymaker? Is there a way to synthesize this information a bit better? Thanks.
Nice questions, thank you.
Manolis Kojevinas from the Barcelona Institute of Global Health. We have talked a lot about empowering people and about governance, and in the scientific associations, I come from the environmental health side, we have done big steps to connect with policy and to engage into local governance. The step from local governance to global governance is huge, and there we have a big problem of how to address this issue. I'm heading one of the largest associations on environmental health, and we were not in the summit Paris on global health, and maybe it wouldn't even make sense for us to be. So, and we're struggling with this issue of how to deal with something which is above local. And it's not clear how scientific associations, how could we deal with these issues of global governance? So this is, but I have a short question for William and Andrew on what you discussed here, in some ways, and we're discussing here, is very Europe and North America centered. How much what you said apply to Seoul and to Shanghai and to Mumbai and to Jakarta?
Yeah, nice question. Let's continue with the last two questions and come back to the panel for final.
Danny Hunter from Biodiversity International, based in Italy. This morning, Robert spoke very eloquently about justice and equality and the loss of the dream, but in the global north. Something that he didn't refer to was the oh, sorry, lost my train of thought. Something that he didn't refer to this morning was that and that we haven't spoken much about this week is the issue of development justice and environmental justice, or the lack of it, and the fact that millions and millions of people in the global south have really lost that dream hundreds and hundreds of years ago. So my question to the panel is, now, where do they see that sitting in terms of planetary health as a philosophy and as part of ending ignorance, because there is a lot of ignorance around those issues, and where it might actually sit in relation to new economic and business solutions?
Right, that's another huge topic. We could stay through all the day on those ones, but a good one. Last set of, or is this lady also? Two more.
Good morning. I'm Phil Landrigan. I'm from the Mount Sinai School of Medicine in New York. I'm a physician, pediatrician. So I love the optimism that William and Andrew expressed about corporations becoming more socially conscious. It's good. I've seen examples of it myself. I'm an optimist, so it resonates with who I am. But at the same time, in my work, which is focused on toxic chemicals and pollution and their effects on human health, I've dealt for way too many years with corporations like the late Johns Manville, who used to make asbestos until they went bankrupt, the lead industry, Monsanto, whose production of glyphosate has increased 2,500% in 2 decades, and who are doing their best to discredit any information about the possible carcinogenicity of that compound. And then, perhaps most recently, we have the continued production each year of 2 million tons of new asbestos that are coming onto world markets today in 2018, mostly going into the poorest countries in the world. And so while I applaud and feel good about the good steps that some of the more enlightened companies are taking, and hope that more do take it, I worry that it is, in fact, that those efforts are, in fact, voluntary, and that it almost seems to me as though there needs to be a radical transformation of the contract between corporations and society. At least in North America, the principal responsibility of the officers of those companies is to maximize short-term profit. And so long as that's the dominant construct, voluntary efforts to the contrary, I don't see we're going to make any real progress.
Thanks, Phil. Good points, yeah.
Sarah Walpole from the Sustainable Healthcare Education Network. We've talked, I think, about delinking production of generation of stuff and production of waste from whatever measure of progress we use or success, whether that's economic growth or profit or whatever it might be. But I think there's more confusion around the link between employment and progress. We know that we need increased employment, that we have a growing population, but I just wondered whether we actually need to rethink the way that we spend our time and the percentage of time we spend employed, and what the role of the health profession is in doing that, given that that employment and the use of time and lifestyle is very closely related to health, but also how business fits in with that. And second quick question, which relates very much to what Philip just said. I think we've been talking very much about good businesses that are willing to engage in social accountability. And we've seen from things like the Global Contract for Social Accountability that non-voluntary, non-binding agreements do not necessarily improve the conduct of companies. And I'm just wondering whether we need to talk about what we do when companies are not necessarily entities for good, and how we can sort of manage the risk that are associated with that, particularly in situations like in healthcare, where the consumer is blind to the outcomes, and where companies are coming in, it's much more difficult for us to know whether what they're doing is socially and medically beneficial.
Well, those were really fabulous comments, all of them. Thank you very much. And so from the point of view of the Planetary Health Economic Council, they're all great takeaways for our own research and questioning. And I'm not going to ask the panel to attempt to answer all of them, but I would like to come back to each of you to pick on one. But they covered issues like technology, huge topic. Who are the losers? Task Force on Financially Related Disclosures comes to mind there, in forms of new regulation to really deal with those who are not alert to the losses, the balance sheet losses they will have from climate change. The scale of local government to global, I mean, absolutely critical issue, this issue of interrelationships of scales of institutions. Justice, you know, there's a whole issue about where does justice sit on this. Voluntary versus preventative or punitive approach is really, really important. And this issue about jobs, where are the jobs in the future, and how employment plays. Really massive topics. We're already 30 seconds into the coffee break. So give us a couple of minutes, and I will just go down through the panel to pick one, no more, of those topics on which you would like to make a brief comment, please. Michael, why don't I start with you and we can just work.
Where to start? Okay, so social justice, does it sit right in the middle of new economics and well-being economics? Absolutely it does. You know, there was a comment there at the end that there was a bit of despair, really, that there are those laggards who are still producing the environmental bads, despite all of the work of the other sort of voluntary type organizations who are kind of the early adopters, the leaders, if you like. But I think the social justice angle, what slightly encourages me is the fact that I think the incredible alienation and inequality that the current system is producing is actually going to create its own backlash to move us in the direction whereby it won't just be legislation which will hopefully stamp out the producers of asbestos finally and all of the other environmental bads, but actually there will be such a drive because of this alienation and inequality driven by the current system that other sort of pressures will come upon these to cease their actions. So it absolutely sits right in the middle. And if you want to have a huge conversation about whether or not we're looking to move beyond capitalism or we can actually sort of keep capitalism and change it, I'll happily chat afterwards, but I don't think I've got time to do it now. So.
Thanks. What an awesome set of questions. I'd love to go at all of them. But the technology question and actually referencing blockchain is an interesting one for me. Blockchain has the potential to be transformative in traceability in particular, the traceability of materials in supply chains. And a really exciting application of this right now is under an initiative called the World Bank of Codes. And this is about trying to use blockchain to map actually the genetic resources, starting with the Amazon, but expanding out to the rest of the world. And the exciting thing here is that something under the Convention on Biological Diversity called the Nagoya Protocol was designed to help countries that host huge amounts of important genetic resources exploit those resources sustainably and actually get money back for the uses of those resources in pharmaceutical products, for example. And that's been essentially, practically speaking, impossible because of the challenges of traceability. And so blockchain has the real potential to unlock that and unlock an enormous amount of funding as a result for conservation of biological diversity. And I'm really quickly going to touch on one other question. I know it's against the rules, but you mentioned that someone mentioned that this is very Europe and North America centered, and actually I would dispute that. I mean, unfortunately for me, I'm traveling the whole time because none of my clients are in Europe, and so in Jakarta was mentioned, I think, in the heart of Borneo, WWF and others are using environmental valuation to great ends. I was out in Mumbai, I was out in Brazil. It really actually, this sort of notion of natural capital and the value of natural systems is being applied very broadly around the world in lots of different cultures.
Thank you.
Great. Yeah, fantastic questions. I'm going to take on big corporations and the question around big corporations. And, you know, it's a huge irony that the listed public corporation has become the bad guy in terms of global development, because actually it's a fundamentally democratic structure. When it was invented by the Dutch in the early 1600s, before then, the ordinary public had no opportunity to invest in sort of big enterprise activity. So, you know, before that, it was kings and queens, and it was wealthy individuals. So when the kind of listed public company came along, you had a chance to be a shareholder, and you also had a chance to become a voting member of the decision-making governance of that business. Now, somewhere along the way, the dream went badly wrong, but the answer is, you know, publicly listed corporations are actually owned by you. They're owned by the people in this room through your pension plans. We own publicly listed corporations. So we have the means to drive change in those big systemically important businesses. And I would say use it. You know, if you're a member of a pension plan, have you actually written to your trustees and tell them that you value environmental and social outcomes as much as financial return? Get them to put pressure on their investment manager, people like us, to justify how we invest. Consider alternative investment funds like a positive change impact fund. You know, so the solutions are there. We don't need to engineer the whole system to make it work much better for people.
I'm going to take on technology as well, and I'm going to use a term that one of my colleagues is very fond of, which is teenage white heroes, which he used in response to the number of people that he thought were literally falling over themselves to create apps for Ebola, without taking into account that internet penetration in West Africa at the time was less than 1%, and that 1% was almost entirely due to the NGO workers who had access to the internet. So I think we have to be very careful of looking at what technology is the latest buzz technology in the global north and assuming it can solve the global south's problems. I think when we do think about technology, what we need to do is look at what problems the global south has and then look at what technology can best solve that. And again, going back as an example to sanitation, sometimes a large-scale Western sanitation sewer system isn't appropriate in remote rural areas of large African countries, but actually kind of small septic tanks or toilets that store the waste inside the toilet is a much more appropriate technological action. So, and there are people, for instance, Andy Dearden, who you may know, Dorothea Kleiner up at Sheffield University, do a lot of work with technology that is appropriate for the global south. So I think we need, when we think about technology, we need to think very closely about what is appropriate for the context, what actually solves the context, involve the people who have the problem in explaining what the problem is, and then seeing how the technology that we use can get towards that. And I think it's the wrong way around to say, what can technology do to solve this problem? It's what technologies are there, one of which may be best solved by blockchain, but there may also be other ways to get there. And within that as well, we need to be very careful about that employment idea. I haven't yet seen a society that's gone to everybody doing 20-hour weeks. It goes to half the population doing 40-hour weeks and the other half of the population being unemployed. And until you can convince me that there is a way that we can work technology better into that model, I think we also need to be looking at the equity issues and the justice issues whenever we talk about introduction of technology.
Thanks, Jenny. I should say that Catherine helped co-create this panel, so I think it's nice that you have the last word.
Thank you. And picking up where where Jenny left off, actually. I think if we have got an empty chair, maybe for public sector, but also there's a concept that I think has been at the back of some of the discussions this morning, but not been named perhaps as explicitly as it needs to be, and that's inequality. And that inequality links so many of those questions. The issue of global justice, so much of the limiting to life chances of our friends and cousins and families in the global south is due to the operations of the economic models in the global north that are very literally chewing up the ecological space that will enable those people in the global south to increase their material living standards. When we talk about pensions as well, I mean, I care about pensions. I've got my pension. I'm worried about it. But I'm extraordinarily fortunate to have a pension. I mean, if you think of the world's population, we're quite rare. And even here in the UK, there are parts of Scotland where people were not even going to live to pensionable age. So again, we've got to build in those conversations about inequality into where we're using those leverage points. There was a conversation yesterday about population and consumption, and it's rare, all too rare, to hear those issues talked about together. But when we're talking about consumption, we have to look at it. Who is it? Who's consuming more? And there's plenty of statistics that it's the lifestyles and the ecological footprint of the richest people in the world who are taking more, emitting more carbons, eating more meat, taking up more of the planet's resources that are taking it away from others, because it's one planet. So we are talking zero-sum game here, which is sad, but it also opens up a conversation about sharing better, which is much nicer and much more positive conversation. And so we've got to put the lens of inequality through all these questions, whether it's technology, as Jenny has said, but also when we're talking about cost-benefit analysis, whose costs and whose benefits. And until we start asking those sorts of questions, we're still going to be having these same conversations in 20, 15 years, and those children that we saw yesterday will be up here on these panels in 10, 15 years saying we still need to do something rather than talking about, hey, isn't this progress fantastic?
So thank you. Before we close, three things. First, apologies for eating into your coffee break, into the time of that. Second, I hope we've convinced you that finance, business and economics is not just part of the problem, it's clearly part of the solution to planetary health. And I'm going to go and talk to Richard Horton, find out whether we cheered him up a little bit, and to whether we are responding to that challenge to really make this community to step up, to really be the thing that it can be. And I feel encouraged by, yes, there's lots of optimism here, and that's the motivator. We have to be optimistic. But I think there's some realism. These are people with real jobs, doing real things with real businesses, and I think that's a sign of what we can be together. So big thanks to the panel.